I've seen a lot of stuff on the internet recently about sovereignty concerns, big mining operations, big corporations, all of this, what the voice will mean. This is very understandable. Hopefully by the end of this video, you'll understand that a no vote will actually allow the sovereignty of lots of First Nations to continue to be extinguished. I will outline in detail how Aboriginal land has been and will continue to be exploited through mining and land clearing operations unless we do something. So first, we should clarify our concepts. There's two concepts of sovereignty that we're talking about here. There's First Nation sovereignty, which is their own. We can't touch it. That's their land, spiritual connections, all of that, it's ongoing. But what we can touch is our Western system of democracy. We have been imposing our laws onto First Nations people since we got here, and that's not going to change, unfortunately. The Western system of democracy is an international concept which has caused, over the last 1,000 years, so many wars, arguments, disagreements, because other people are trying to assert their sovereignty. So the law allows it to be ceded in 3 different ways: conquest, cession, or occupation. I think people are concerned the voice will create a treaty fulfilling the second requirement and ceding to the government. But unfortunately, through massacres and large-scale military operations from British conquest since we got here, it's already happened for most First Nations. Remember, Australia was made up of hundreds of different tribes, languages and cultures with their own sovereignty in terms of Western sovereignty. In 1972, the Yolngu people tried to stop the Nabalco Company from mining bauxite on their land. They took it to Northern Territory Supreme Court and tried to argue that because they had sovereignty, the mining company couldn't mine on their land. While the court recognised that it'd have some connection and system of laws over the land, the court said that because much of it had been extinguished, and the court alleged their culture had changed from when before British people had got there. So because of that, then they didn't have sovereignty anymore. So then they allowed the Nabalco Company to go into their land and mine it, frack it, destroy, whatever. I'm now going to play a clip of law holder Grandma Mulara and then offer my criticism. I mean no disrespect to her or her people. I only want to point out some inconsistencies in the words that she is using.
The Constitution that we are being asked to vote on is not the same Constitution as the Founding Fathers. It's not the founding Constitution to this country. In 1973, I'll leave his hat on because that's when this brought in. 1973, our Constitution was changed. The founding Constitution and the governance of our country and our peoples at that time was moved sideways in 1973 by Gough Whitlam. And what came in was a model of a corporation. It looks and feels the same as what we did have, but what's different here is that we didn't get to vote on it. Parliament became sovereign. A Queen of Australia was invented, and neither of which are legal truths.
Gough Whitlam tried to change one section of the Constitution, but it did not end up happening because Parliament voted no. What I think she might be talking about is 1973 Woodward Royal Commission into land clearing in the Northern Territory. It found that First Nations had a claim to vacant Crown land if they could prove a connection. But that means by default, all land is Crown land, and it's on the First Nations people to prove their connection. So it's up to them to assert their sovereignty into the Western system. What First Nations people have to do to prove their sovereignty, it's shifty, it's changed over the last 30 years as the common law has evolved, but currently they need to prove some sort of economic or financial interest to the land, or they need to prove historical property like skeletal remains. This is not good. This is terrible. It means we have ongoing desecration of sacred Aboriginal sites with nothing really to stop it. But it didn't alter or swap the Constitution like she says. There's no evidence to indicate this. Sovereignty, as recognised by the Western system, is called native title, which is what Mabo did in 1992. If First Nations people are granted native title, then they are allowed by our system to exercise sovereignty over that land. But this is a preamble to her main concern, which I'll play now.
If we say yes to the voice for the Indigenous peoples, we come on to this charter, which is like a rule book, the rules for the corporation. It means that the original people of this country will cede their sovereignty.
Yes, the Constitution is a rule book and everyone must follow it. I wish it weren't the case, but we have been imposing our laws since we got here on First Nations people, and that's not going to stop. If that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't have massive First Nations people in our prison systems, which completely ignores their own customs or ways of dealing with their laws, and we wouldn't have massive land clearing, massive desecration of Aboriginal sites. Like, we just don't respect their own system of laws without native title. Native title is the only way they can do this. And remember, the Mabo case and legislation which introduced native title was actually introduced by a Labor government. The Liberal government tried to oppose it so they could let their mining corporations and friends like hack, drill, whatever, destroy land. Then she goes on to talk about the corporation. She says the government is the corporation, and she doesn't think First Nations people should be working with the government. Also clarify here that I think she's talking about this thing that's going around that says Australia is listed as a corporation. So that means maybe in the SEC in America they have Australia listed in the as a corporation, or that when we have birth certificates, which is like a straw man of the corporation, but our natural person is not obliged to any laws and stuff. And there's heaps of more claims they make. It's a body of constitutional theory, but none of it has actually held up in court. So it's just theory at best. And the government is still going to like force its laws on you. Kind of like saying like First Nations law is valid. Like, yes, it is valid, it is good, but that doesn't change how the government is going to enforce its laws upon us as citizens, whether that's a good or a bad thing. If you're a First Nations person, that's probably a bad thing. Aboriginal lawyers and activists know this, they know how all this works, they've spent their lives studying it, and they're working to bring awareness to the government. This would stop them from claiming ignorance for all of this that I've said. The Liberal National Party want the No's to succeed so they can keep tweaking, giving loopholes to their corporate friends, making the laws to weaken like they did in 17, which over the next 5 years saw land clearing rates jump by 1,300%. You can level your criticisms at Labor, but you wouldn't find any policies that have been this damaging to wildlife, the economy, or First Nations people. They actually have an environmental action plan based on solid economic grounds. Without constitutional recognition or some other massive structural change, there's nothing in place to stop. Sacred sites will keep being destroyed, land clearing will keep going, and like I said, they have to go through our shitty little court systems to prove their standing, and if they get approved, then they still have to like fight massive corporations with millions of dollars that can just throw lawyers at them over and over. Like, it's a broken system, but this is actually a step towards improving it. All that being said, you still probably have a heap of concerns about the voice. You could probably send me a bunch of links to stuff you've seen probably other people talk about, other bad things it will do. I don't have time to look at each one and point out whether it's good or not. And you can't make the argument for them. All you can do is send me the link. So don't try to make the argument for them. Don't even send me the link. If you're going to send me the link, tell me why I should trust the link. Do you have a reason to trust it? That is the most important thing. Because if you don't have an objective reason to trust it, then they could be lying and you wouldn't know. So how do you stop lies? Because you don't want lies, right? Lies are bad. They'll make you think things about the world and they'll make you act badly. So how do you stop yourself from being lied to? It's in your ability to figure out what you can trust and what you can't. It's not in your ability to, well, it is if you want to spend like 20 years researching something and then you can talk about a topic on a very deep level, but that's one specific area. You're not going to be able to do that for every area. So you need a way to look at what other people have done, look at their work and say, is this good? Do I want to quote this? Should I form my opinions about what they've said? That you can do, and you can do it easily. Just think of any way to do it that doesn't go off your emotions. So you see something, you're like, oh, that's true. Okay, oh, but remember, people lie, so it could be lying to me. How do I justify this is true? So a few things you could do. Government reports, peer review, independent news articles. Now you'd say, like, peer review can be bought, all these places can be bought, government can lie. It can. And if they are, if that government report is lying, and if that peer-reviewed journal article is lying, then you're right. I shouldn't trust that peer-review article. But you look at the majority of peer-review articles, they are not bought. If they are, then you could say, oh, you shouldn't trust this, and I'll cede it to you, and I'll say, okay, yes, true. But we should be having a conversation about whether we should trust the sources. The conversation is not what they're saying, the conversation is why we should trust them. The majority of academics, 80% of First Nations people, are for the Voice. I have good reasons to trust them. Do you have good reasons to trust whatever you're watching? Do you have a way to figure out if they're lying or not? We can have a conversation about that. But we got to figure out who we can trust before we can start talking about all these issues and all these claims and stuff. You should share this video. Show it to like all your friends, anyone who might be voting. Not to give me clout, like not to give me approval or anything, but because there's so much like disinformation and stuff going around. People are so confused. They don't actually know about this stuff. Like, people are pretty reasonable, but like, I've shown you why. I've shown you the stakes. I've shown you why it's bad. So we need to spread the awareness. This took me was one term of law school, like 6 weeks of law school, and like some internet research, a bit of critical analysis, and I was able to like figure this out. Not hard, but like most people just can't be bothered to do that, and that's okay. Like, you got better things to do with your time, but I just have. So like and subscribe.